I know it, but it has not worked out very well for me. I don't know. The editing is much more cumbersome. I find the Zoom editing much easier.
Okay.
So here we go. Uh, Dr. Shambu Prasad, welcome, and I'm happy to have you today for those first podcast we are doing on the Dharampal Centenary celebrations. And you had a long association with Dharampal and his thought process. When is the first time you, what is your first knowledge or memory of Dharampal or encountering Dharampal?
Thanks, Ram, for having me over and for having this conversation today on Dharampalji's centenary. Uh, my first memories of Dharampalji was while I was doing my bachelor's at IIT Madras, and I think we probably got introduced him through uh, Claude Alvarez, who came and spoke in one of the extramural lectures. And I don't recollect exactly. I think Dharampalji also came and spoke a bit later, and we had a few conversations after that. And I guess it was much more during my master's work again at IIT Madras when PPST was quite active with its PPST bulletins and discussions around it that I had a bit more of an opportunity to get to know his work. Um, and a greater
I'm
engagement.
going to pause you there. I'm going to pause you there. For those who don't know, I think you need to mention PPST a bit. Claude Alvarez, I will talk about a bit later, but PPST, you need to expand a bit more.
So, in a sense, the amongst people looking at science and the direction of science in India, there were various kinds of debates, and by the 80s there was some sense of disillusionment with many of the elite institutions, especially from the IITs, doing a bit of self-reflection on what is happening to the manpower that India is generating. So there was a discussion on the issue of brain drain, equally in discussion on what was happening to our Indian scientific journals and so on. And around that time, many of these scientists also kind of got acquainted with Dharampalji's work. And that's how the Patriotic and People Oriented Science and Technology Foundation, or PPST for short, got created. And some of them work full time, in exploring dimensions of Ayurveda or in agriculture, and a few others went looking at the more foundational issues of Indian civilization. So it's around some of these discussions that I also got a chance to revisit some of Dharampalji's work, and the turning point possibly was when I started working with artisanal textiles, and that was an interesting time of engagement because we were kind of traversing between the field insights that we found, and along with Uzrama, who was in Dastakar, Andhra, and Ramakrishna and Srinivas, who were doing work in Adilabad. So they were actually trying to recreate some of these ideas of Indian steel making at that point in time. So it's I was more of an interloper in some sense, not directly involved, but we always had an opportunity to have these conversations with Dharampalji.
Hmm. Um, among the several things, I mean, I'm always fascinated by this note of yours, which you wrote on the Dharampalji, I think, in 2007, after his demise, uh, for CSDS. And it's kind of, I think in the previous version of the website, we had this for download, and probably the most downloaded article from Dharampalji's site, and most read. And I've always come back to it and quoted from it because you have mentioned in the current context, you look at him as an organic intellect and a dissenting scholar.
True.
So I'm going to probe you a bit on that because what is the role of dissent in academia today, and where do you see its non being not adequately represented, particularly in the social sciences? having let us down or taken us in a wrong path heavily in the last, let's say, 10, 15 years. And we'll come to Dharampal later, but as somebody who's also been part of this and having taken several initiatives in networking, bridging the gap yourself, where do you see it having its biggest, let's say, damage and for of not having dissenting scholarship?
So there are two things that I'd like to reflect on. One is possibly, looking at, I've been revisiting a bit on post-development theory, for instance, and the development dictionary, which some of us also got a chance to read almost at the time when it was released. And, we were reading a bit of Ivan Illich and others. And there is an interesting phase that Illich speaks of. And Illich uses this phrase of a set of scholars being deprofessionalized intellectuals. People who, and I would tend to think that Dharampalji was almost in the same mold. There are two aspects of it which is important. The critical aspect of it was the scholarship that Dharampalji had, more or less like the Ivan Illich having the same kind of traditions of scholarship, and choosing in some sense not to carry that so heavily in a normal academic setting, being a professor and so on, but to have this engagement of these ideas with wider society. And that I think is an interesting trait that, and we don't seem to have enough of these deprofessionalized intellectuals in Indian life today. So, and I think Dharampal was a representation of, in some sense, rebelling against our ways of looking at Indian society and polity. Uh, and in the process, also offering a very interesting way of looking at history. And I think that is, because in my later part of my work, and I tended to start getting more into understanding history of science and technology, which also became a part of my PhD thesis. I think this ability of Dharampalji to, carry that rigor of scholarship and carry on this engagement with, people of different views uh, was something that uh, probably is missing today. I think clearly, in a sense, the need to look at history differently, that the Indians generally have a tendency, Indian societies, broadly speaking, have a tendency to look at history in a slightly non-linear manner, to look at oral histories, that there are several kinds of views. There could be a toing and froing of ideas. I think that was a very, very interesting contribution of what Dharampalji had said. So, in a sense, I think, these this difficult word that we would say, the Indian mind, Bharatiya Chit, Manas, and Kal, that there is an Indian way of looking at things. Sometimes it's very difficult when we say, there is an Indian ethos, and people tend to align you too closely with a certain political orientation. But I guess the key element is that there is a particular direction that Dharampalji was suggesting, which we don't seem to have pursued enough. And I say this specifically because uh, I would have been very happy to see that in this attempt to rewrite history, we would have matched the kind of scholarship that Dharampalji had in trying to explore areas where conventional historians and the Indian Council of Historical Research has possibly ignored. Unfortunately, that scholarship and the ability to engage with historical material is possibly missing today. We would have been happy to see people follow Dharampalji's work and bring in the same kind of scholarship. And it requires more than a few people to actually capture these local histories that we have all around the country, to make that linkage between some of these ideas. I mean, specifically, to try and understand this very important book in today's context is Civil Disobedience in the Indian Tradition. So, how is it that this idea of civil disobedience, which is so much part of our culture, and suggesting that Gandhi actually took it from things that were kind of in the air, so to speak. Uh, and somehow we are trying to suggest that, dissent is something, uh, to be looked down upon. The state is coming out with a very, very heavy arm against what is happening with regard to any alternate viewpoint, whether it is from the young or otherwise. Um, I would have felt that, it is a case of dissenting scholarship, and either the scholarship is missing and the dissent part is also missing in people trying to talk about Dharampalji's work. I'm not sure if I've answered you, but roughly that's where I'm getting at.
No, you are leading me to more exciting questions.
Okay.
That is really interesting because you said both scholarship and dissent is missing. Uh, Now that was different because I was going to ask you some follow-up question from the earlier point you mentioned. Do you think the scholarship has become very anecdotal rather than theorizing? Like when you mentioned, if you were to start defining Indian ethos, no, or what you had, in fact, earlier you had written about it as a non-linear history. I think in this article also you mentioned that, and then you also mentioned it even while you were talking today. Why is it that uh, are there enough people writing and theorizing on these diverse forms of non-linear histories in India, historiographies in India, in the Indian space? And why is that kind of an attempt not yet in the, I mean, have you become very anecdotal in perhaps compilations, not having the courage? Because I remember Claude once mentioned this, that for 40 years, if you're carrying a Jola to go and buy books from the Western scholars, and only that is being reproduced by our scholars, they'll never ever get around the courage to theorize themselves. Because in Dharampal's case, there was always this sense of maybe what she will call a play, or speculative, a certain tenacity with which he will speculate and come up with a theory. I, in fact, was a witness to one such theorizing that he did on the entire scriptural writing, only to be knocked off by his neighbor Nair, this elderly Gandhian who used to live next door to Dharampal, who just challenged Dharampal the moment he read the note. Nairji came, I remember, and said, "You have no validity to ask these questions because you have not gone through a formal way of learning these scriptures. Without having gone through the formal way of learning, you probably do not stand a chance in critiquing or taking this critical view of it." Dharampalji was a good sport. He kind of said, "Yeah, maybe you're right." So he dropped. I remember that conversation happened. Um, do you see this? Um, I mean, where do you see this gap? Because I often feel that maybe we stop at the anecdotal level and don't go to the next level in bringing our things and theorizing them. Do you see that as a major challenge for the academia and scholarship in India?
So I think there are two, three things here. The first part is the decline of the social sciences. If I were to put it rather bluntly, uh, I think you know we seem to be asking lesser and lesser kinds of questions nowadays, uh, and also in a sense less rigorously. And I think that's the, I mean, looking at Dharampalji's work, I was always, strangely curious that he would do I mean, he was an expert in reading archival work and spent probably decades in it, looking at the work. But he would still be there would be a certain tentativeness in the way he would articulate some of his things, especially in conversation. Probably this is what Gandhi was meaning, and so on. Uh, and I think today we are like, without doing any bit of work, we are more certain about our own projections and so on. And to me, the key thing is the rigor that went into the work that he did is an art actually of looking at documents, but not but also having the larger perspective, to not be pedantic about them, to be able to get, I mean, get the essence, so to speak, of these, and then use this to engage with larger questions. The difficulty with some of the things that you mentioned as being anecdotal is that, one, there is this lack of scholarship. And the other side is this thing that, okay, I don't know the scriptures, or I have not read the scriptures as well as someone else has done. I don't think that's anything new. I mean, maybe Gandhi faced the same kind of issues when he was taking on some aspects of taking out untouchability, and had to have these dialogues with scholars of a particular kind. Uh, and it is not completely Gandhi's own work to be doing this. And I think that's the point I'd like to make, that it was not necessary for Dharampalji to read all the Sanskrit texts to make things happen. There would be with Gandhi a person like Vinoba, who understood where Gandhi was coming from and would give the kind of Upanishadic, backing, and because of his understanding in Indian theology, so to speak, to get there. The point essentially is, we do not have that ecosystem around Dharampalji who could have pursued these points in very different ways. I mean, I could almost imagine a huge research program where he's offering some idea and scholars tend to try and work around it. Interestingly, young people, when I was young, and I think you also know many of them, spent some time with Dharampalji. But perhaps one of the difficulties that many of us lacked was we were probably more enthusiastic than rigorous in terms of scholarship. So we would love to talk, but we never end up writing. And I think some of the traits that Dharampalji picked up, probably because of his stint in UK, or maybe other kinds of places, was the rigor. And sometimes there's a lazy sense of an Indian in not documenting things as much. So we may have great conversations, but we aren't able to follow it up enough in terms of scholarships and outputs. So, in some sense, I think after people spent 6 months with Dharampal, there was a slight frustration, perhaps on both sides, that this wasn't quite happening. And I think Dharampalji was looking for who would take on his legacy. And that's still a very, very open kind of question, because I don't think that's been answered fully yet. Geeta ji is doing a great work in trying to take this further, but it really does require a much larger engagement with many people trying to take certain aspects and follow it up with, a certain kind of scholarship, as well as the ability to have these conversations in universities and outside universities with people interested in the future of India and its economy and society.
That's really fantastic what you're laying out, because I really, this is exactly what I was looking for. I wanted this to be a conversation in present continuous rather than talk in the past. And that Dharampalji never really dwelt in the past. For him, history was only a present continuous. He always spoke about present. I mean, he would go back 500 years into the past and bring insights, but he would always point out that to something that is happening now. And I mean, I'm as much to I think you make me feel guilty at some point when you mention the rigor part, because anything we had, any issue we discussed with him, he would say, "Can you write 20 pages on it?" You know, Dharampalji, the benchmark was, if you had something to say on any subject, you should be able to write 20 pages on it. And with him, the 20 pages was a some kind of a benchmark. And I don't think many of us qualified doing the 20-page test with him. So somebody once, I think we were traveling somewhere, and someone called from my mobile phone and said, "Oh, Dharampalji, I have read him and amazed at insights that I'm drawing, etc." And I said, "I'm sitting next to Dharampalji. You want to talk to him?" And so Dharampalji said, "Okay, I'll talk to him." So we parked somewhere on the roadside, and he was talking. So he heard this man go gaga about how this has been such a great discovery for him, etc. And after about 2 minutes, Dharampalji asked him, "So why don't you write 10 pages about this and send it to me?" And I think that's the last time I heard from that young man. So beyond that, that conversation didn't go. Coming to one of the points that you have raised earlier, which is very interesting about is how much of being politically correct is impacting scholars' work today.
Um, I think the sense of autonomy and independence is kind of going away. So people are either of one hue or the other. And
Mm.
protecting that independent space is very critical for academia. Otherwise, we lose our moorings, so to speak. And to a large extent, I mean, one could disagree with some formulations of what Dharampal had said, but you have, uh, a certain clarity and points of departure, if you would like, because it's reasonably well articulated, and so on. But that dialogue is missing. I mean, people aren't speaking across. I mean, it's just this or that kind of situation, which is in a sense a bit worrying. And I think this idea of Dharampalji's work should be seen as a celebration of the plurality of Indian culture, and making this, I mean, there are various traditions of Indian culture across the. In his own work, he didn't draw upon only one particular part, and it was not to say that what happened in Chengalpettu actually happened in across the country and so on. And I think that essence of this plurality is likely to get lost in this totalitarian and almost centralizing tendency in which we are looking at Indian culture and civilization today. That's a bit worrying. I don't think that is what perhaps Dharampalji's work was meant to be. And what is, I think, at the end of it, I mean, this major contribution that he had about this idea of oceanic circles, that the Indian polity was around a huge element of decentralization. Of course, the panchayats today are not the same as it might have been in whatever was the olden days. And they may never have been a golden age, so to speak. But I think it was an imagination of a possibility of society organized differently. And decentralization was a very fundamental aspect of this. And I think that aspect is completely missing, in much of the discourse today. If I might just take an aside, I was in a Will Grow Unconvention discussion sometime back on digitization, and I mean, there's this talk about the agri stack. And I think the basic point that came out, do you think agri stack is going to solve all the problems? And my response to that was that, the agri stack is you're creating a massive infrastructure without consulting the people of India. And the farmers' protest, if they've told you anything, it's just to tell you clearly that the elite, whether it is 5 people, 10 people, whether it was the Congress or the left or anyone, not at all having this dialogue with the people, and then coming out with a version that this is the best thing for you, is only going to create a more of a challenge in trying to get people to accept it. And without involving people in the vision of the future, we may tend to go against the very fundamentals of what might be Indian civilization.
That is fantastic. You brought more contemporary issue there. I mean, the burning issue of the farmers. But I still remember Dharampalji once even saying this very clearly. He said, when is it that any Indian politician or any policy maker has ever gone to the farmer and asked him, what do you want? Or how do you think we should govern ourselves? Maybe if they did ask that question without having uh, the arrogance with which we normally approach, maybe the farmer does know how to govern this country. And for me, the best example of that was sitting in a remote village in Tamil Nadu, listening to two farmers converse with each other in Malay. And these are farmers who migrate to Malaysia just for a few years in their life as construction laborers, and then bring back the money and build a house, buy a vehicle, or whatever. And they could converse in Malay and Mandarin in that village very casually. And sitting under a tree, one of them told me all about since when the problem started for India in the Indian Ocean strategically. When the time we opened up the Andaman Islands for outside people to come, etc. And I was shocked that he knew so much about all of this. And he was talking to me about different strategic priorities of the country very casually under the tree. He was telling me, it all started in the 70s and it could have been stopped then. But now we can't be worried about Sri Lanka having this problem, you know, because others are all there now, kind of thing. So it was amazing for me to listen to this. And time and again, it reminded me of this conversation that Dharampalji used to say, we don't ask our farmers anything because Dharampaji also did this in his own life. I mean, he used to sit and listen to uh, the farmer, the school teacher, the village lady who used to come and cook in the kitchen. He used to talk to her. She used to come and tell him all the stories of the village, and he would sit and listen to her patiently. While some scholar goes from Chennai, he would probably pretend that he's got a headache, and after 5 minutes there'll be this thing. Okay, I don't feel very well. I want to rest a bit or something. So that will happen also. Um, coming to one more aspect where you also have done enormous amount of work in terms of trying to push the focus into the way science and technology policy has been made in this country. How far do you feel? I know we're, I said half an hour, and I'm going slightly beyond the time. I will not take more time. Just one question. How far do you think the knowledge or the entire knowledge that was created, not just by Dharampalji, but also several other people who were looking at people's sciences and technologies in various formulations at that period in time, that entire body of knowledge which created research, when we look at the society today, I mean, how much of it is there as a discourse in the contemporary science and technology thinking, in academia, in policy making, in our research priorities, as well as a sensitivity when we are dealing with planning, for instance. Where does it fit in today, or where does it not seem to be fitting in? And where do you think we lost it? Because I think in the 70s, 80s, till some point in the 90s, this enormous push in documenting all these knowledge kept happening. Maybe in the last 10, 15 years, maybe we haven't seen that many documentations happening either, nor does it seem to be part of the mainstream discourse in the sense of, except the romantic ones of celebrating Indian achievement in this, that, and the other, without in a kind of um, in an isolated celebratory kind of a manner, rather than having any real impact on one's daily life. Maybe the few places we have taken off, maybe yoga, but these are also driven by the market realities. If there is a global market, they seem to have found a traction as a knowledge system, and our pride is enjoined today increasingly to the market, or what the market determines as having some currency. So, where do you think we lost? Where do you think this diversion happened? Because I mean, I'm asking this not just from Dharampal's work, but also several other people who worked at that period in time, or people who have inspired by him who did work. Where do you think we went amiss there?
I mean, I can only surmise an answer to this. So, I mean, just to start off with, I mean, because we've had this time of discussion of the farm bills, and when we were looking at it, it's around the same time that uh, the Indian government had a science policy document and the science and technology innovation policy that has come out. And but what was interesting in its own kind of way, it might be a bit sarkari in some sense, was an attempt to at least say this is the policy we have. We would like some opinions, and there was actually a set of consultations that went on. I think in terms of the process, not necessarily the product, uh, the the scientific establishment was through this policy trying to obviously do something that never happened in the farm bills. I mean, there's no record of any kind of consultation that happened before the farm bills were released. Uh, so I think this openness and the need, the belief that in basic democracy is sometimes going away. We tend to think that it is a bad idea to try and have a discussion. It's a bad idea to try and talk about something. We may disagree, but not giving that space and voice for people is something which we seem to be losing today. And that I think is probably, I mean, we're not even having a serious engagement with this draft document. I don't see PPST or any group saying, I mean, the kind of rich discussions that the PPST group had in the 1990s is probably not happening with regard to the science policy document today. So that those spaces are missing. And I think that's kind of somewhat important before we talk and move further. There could be a few pegs around which we could work around. I mean, there is a talk of inclusion in this inclusion in equity. So around that, what does inclusion and equity mean in science and technology? How do we look at different kinds of knowledges? If there is a trend towards pushing more traditional knowledge systems, which is kind of reflected partly in the increase in budgets, so to speak. Are we backing it with a little bit of rigor, with a little bit of engagement, with a little bit of dialogue, the kinds of things that possibly Darshan Shankar and others have been trying into use, perhaps a certain kind of fusion of different kinds of knowledge systems in Ayurveda. I think that requires more intensive work. It's probably happening at the fringes of much of our scientific establishment, but not quite featuring as part of the discussions and debates. And I think it's still a very much of an unfinished task. I don't know where these things are going to start all over again. Uh, but I mean, just to give the other side of it, I mean, it's sometimes very, very encouraging to see a youngster like, say, Swaminathan, who is going around collecting cotton varieties. He gets excited about an idea, traveling the length and breadth of the country, and then trying to set up his enterprise in Tamil Nadu. But I mean, that's the kind of engagement that we're talking of in terms of trying to find a contemporary expression of um, the rich and diverse traditions that maybe Dharampal was talking of in Indian science and technology, or even just to try and change the organizing principles. The whole point about, let us say, if there's an Indian way of doing an agri stack, I would think that the Indian way of doing an agri stack should have been in such a way that the data that is collected is not used for surveillance purpose, but which is kind of done in a manner in which the farmer is empowered to take a decision on a real-time basis. Now, that is something that Indians can do, given our expertise in science and technology. But if we follow the same, centralizing tendency and trying to sell data to the market, and forgetting that farmers have every right to data privacy as you and me want to have, I think we are missing a fair bit in terms of how do we go about in terms of science and technology. It's not trying to be the number one or number two scientific manpower, show our might in terms of the journals that we have published and all of that. But I think in terms of creativity, originality, innovation, and paths and directions that we should be doing differently, uh, we don't see enough of an expression of that. If the central vista, I mean, I think Dharampal would have been very happy to know that the parliament is going to be destroyed. But the alternative to it is absolutely not the central vista project, is just no way is an alternative to this kind of a institution. Could it have been designed differently? Could it have been thought about differently? Unfortunately, those discussions about what our new institution should be isn't quite happening.
Well, that's very interesting you say that. But I have one follow-up question to that. Is the vernacular any? role to play at all in this? Because I remember that Dharampalji in his last days kept telling many of his people, go now, stop writing in English, go into the local languages, and you should concentrate on the local language and what is written in it. And he used to always point out to Guruji Ravindra Sharma and his narrative traditions that are prevalent in the area. And he always used to say, we never have understood or given importance to the local languages as much. But in the context of what you just now mentioned, particularly in the science and technology debates, do you see the role of, where do you see? Because we also have a, a reasonably large amount of English educated public. Some people, when we talk about the role of native language, I mean, in one's own circles, if one would say that today, say, no, no, what are you talking about? There is such a large number of English speaking public in India. So, what is this thing you're talking about? That is a very easy question that some people pose. In that sense, where do you see in science and technology context the role of vernacular, both in policy making and understanding, as well as particularly you mentioned the farming space. I mean, I have been sitting through a discussion today on deciding a very large scale intervention of the farm sector in the state in Tamil Nadu. And repeatedly, this thing comes, all the knowledge that is required is already there with the agriculture university. Everything is there with KVKs. The problem is always with how do we reach the last mile. That is the top down approach. That is what it says. So if everything is written, everything is known in English, and it fails to talk in the local, uh, or even listen in the local, which is even more critical. How do you see that today?
Uh, I think there are two levels of it. One is, of course, the vernacular as a language, but as I think I'm not able to remember Illich's idea of the vernacular, and I think he talks about the vernacular in a more broader sense, in terms of vernacular as a knowledge system, maybe an idiom as well. And I'm just remembering a conversation we had yesterday. This was supposed to be an evaluation being done on for the revitalizing rain-fed area network on the idea of agroecology. So I joined a bit late in that conversation, and the interesting part of that evaluation was the fact that there were two or three farmers who also joined on the Zoom platform, and Nekram Sharma was telling his view, even as Anil Verma was saying about what was happening in Bihar and all of us. And when Ravi Chopra was asking these questions, I thought it was a very, very interesting way of trying to say that the future of agroecology cannot be decided only by, you know, you and me talking in English, but we need to listen to, uh, a Himachali farmer or, Uttarakhandi farmer and so on. I think by deliberately adding that element to our discussions and debates, we will add more value. It is not a question of just, I mean, doing a Google Translate kind of situation where we get something in English and then translate that into Hindi or Telugu or Tamil or whatever. But it is a deliberate attempt to try and say, I may not know Telugu and you may not know, English, but we both can actually sit together and talk. And I think that is the beauty. And I suppose that happens universally across, that of course we can have people who might translate and sometimes they may not do a great job, but in the process of deliberately thinking differently, I think the vernacular forces you to change the way you think. And I think that is the direction that was possibly being suggested by Dharampalji. I'm not a, I mean, I don't know many languages other than English, but that's a handicap, I would say. It's become worse during this, probably the last decade, where the mobile phone and all of that has become quite dominant. I mean, we always are kind of surprised at a very, very fundamental level. Why is it that our t-shirts are not in Hindi and Tamil and Malayalam and so on? Why should all our, t-shirts have an expression which goes into the villages as well. That, someone in the village is wearing a Fabregas t-shirt or something like that, with Fabregas's name written there. We are not giving a creative expressions in the vernacular. Uh, that's a huge area where we have been kind of silent on. But today we have greater opportunities of having these vernacular conversations. And it was absolutely fine to have this conversation on Zoom, to even talk to each other in a different kind of manner uh, yesterday. But we are not exploring those directions enough.
So you have spoken about Dharampal's work on Gandhi as one of the significant areas of work. And you, again today, when you earlier spoke, you mentioned about the civil disobedience and the way Dharampalji places it. And Dharampalji, one of the best things that he always maintained and repeatedly emphasized was that uh, he almost looked at Gandhi also, he always would bring him in a present continuous, not as a persona caught up in a historical past. You would always talk about Gandhi as.
I've lost you, Ram.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay, sorry about that. So he always spoke about Gandhi as something of a present continuous. He always maintained that Gandhi was articulating the one quote that he often cited was where Gandhiji says, I have only articulated the hidden aspiration of the mute millions. So Dharampalji always quoted that. He always maintained that what Gandhi did was to pick up those things from ordinary Indians, and that is what he amplified. And this is something that he always tried to highlight. And of course, the civil disobedience was a much bigger theorizing of the same thought process, so to say. How far do you see the work of Dharampal in the context of the Gandhian scholarship that has emerged? Because today it is perhaps far more critical Gandhi that is coming out as scholarship as much as the understanding Gandhi. And Dharampal was always about understanding Gandhi, but he always brought in the engagement with the people along with Gandhi. And even when he mentioned other people who seemed to have a trait of Gandhi in them, he would always point out to this aspect of their engagement with ordinary people of this country, as he put it always, and as he called it always. So, where do you see that as? I mean, how do you see his contribution in that space, as well as where do you see that entire thought process moving forward today?
Uh, yeah, so I kind of, as I said earlier as well, I think my greatest learning was his insights on Gandhi. And he used various metaphors for Gandhi, including often as a military general. I would find it difficult to see him in that light, but but that was more of a way to understand how his mind works, what was his strategy, and so on. Today you have a book by Axel Royd, I guess, or whoever it is, who wrote Gandhi as a CEO. So you can see Gandhi in different kinds of ways. And the purpose of, in some sense, was to understand what is it that Gandhi did and why did he do what he did. And I think for me, the fascinating part was Dharampalji's insights on the institutions that Gandhi built. I mean, there were many who were fascinated by his work on Hind Swaraj, and I think it's been overworked in some sense. It founds the broad, principles around which you want to shape action. But after a point, you say, okay, this is fine. What do I do with it? And that is where the study of either the Khadi or the All India Spinners Association or Gandhi's ashrams or, the Gandhi Seva Sangh as a postgraduate institute of research. All these were very, very interesting directions, or his later articulation on the oceanic circles, which Gandhi, of course, couldn't develop it as much as he would have wanted to. I think these were nuggets of information. Again, one could try and trace some amount of insights in it, but you will have to do a lot of toing and froing to make a creative understanding of what was attempted there. So in a sense, it is more not to be stuck too much with what Gandhi said, but also to try and relate it to what was the possible meaning in it, what was the method in which Gandhi was trying to work around a particular kind of problem. It's difficult to, I mean, the person is not there, so you can't really understand it as much. But the sheer fact that he's been one of the most documented persons in history gives us this opportunity to explore things differently. And I think that's an exploration that not enough students and, you know, even why say students, I think academia is doing enough in trying to follow such kinds of leads. So as I said, I mean, we do have these rich insights on how did the All India Spinners Association work. Now, it's not just about trying to produce khadi. The meanings kept changing over a period of time. And I think he had this, insight in the amazing ability to listen. And at the time of the crisis, and this is just as an example on what happened with the All India Khadi board, or even before All India Spinners Association in 1942, when Sri Krishna Das Jaju, who was the president of All India Spinners Association, wanted to have this dialogue with Gandhi. And there is this lovely piece that is written where Gandhi says, I'm going to give you 1 hour every day and let's try and talk about this. In this process, I'm also going to get more clearer. So he's bringing his organizational challenges that he's facing. And Gandhi is, through this dialogue, thinking through what would be the meaning of Khadi today. And sometimes we miss that kind of a dialogue and the context in which these newer kinds of solutions are being formed. And I think that is an insight that Dharampalji had, which I'm sure allows us to go beyond the historical Gandhi. And that's important. I mean, Gandhi was a great figure, the father of the nation, and so on. But can we imbibe a certain way of looking at Gandhi so that we can drive our own discussions today? And I think the articulation that Dharampalji had, that Gandhi had a sense of history. He was not a historian by any stretch. He knew Upanishads and other things, but he would have a way by which he could intuitively connect scriptures with practice and so on. And I think we're losing sometimes those sense of play between things that seem so, diverse and different.
Uh, yeah, that brings me to another one of my favorite terms of Dharampal. He calls the bureaucracy that was left behind the post-colonial inheritance to Indian governance. He at one point he calls it the order of grave, and I think he repeats it more than once. I think twice or thrice in his entire writing, he repeats this term, order of grave. Uh, what will be your take on a description of the bureaucracy like that?
Well, I think the bureaucracy, and I think this is a view that used to be shared in the 1980s or so, that, I mean, there was, I think it was Professor Ambirajan who was telling us from IIT Madras that the kind of power that a district collector has today is way beyond what a king possibly had during his time, maybe about 200 years back. I think the the overreaching of the state in some sense, and is something that the bureaucracy has possibly aided in, and a tremendous amount of centralization of decision making power and all of that, which is getting worse with the processes of these dashboards and reporting to the bosses and so on. So people who are in power are having a complete lack of sense of a dialogue. Everyone is forced to try and have a video conference and uh, say what have you done, but uh, no, the the people who are governing are not trying to find out what's happening, how are you. Those kinds of questions are kind of missing in the present day governance structure. It would require a huge amount of rethink. You know, right from the point, I mean, we've changed various names. I mean, we've not changed the name of the district collector. So, in a class recently on public systems management, when we were having this discussion, people said, what is it that the district collector collects? And then one thing that came out was, of course, I mean, revenues and so on. But I think that phase is kind of gone. Then somebody else said, what does a district collector collect? He collects a lot of, he or she collects petitions. But I think the relationship between the state and the citizen needs some serious rethink. We have taken on these legacies and sometimes made them more loyal than the king in some sense, in terms of how they were designed.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, for recently, I remember in one other context that this came up was I remember was reading, I think, in one of Dharampalji's articles or lectures that if you're a rich person in Britain in the late 19th century or something, you could buy a collectorship in India. I was telling a bureaucrat friend of mine that we have brought it back fully to the colonial space because today, at some level, the conferred IAS, could be secured in several ways. So you could conferred to you. If you have adequate wealth to distribute, you could get conferred. So at some level, we have reached a colonial levels with the collectorship. So one last question. I know I have taken a lot more of your time than what I had initially anticipated, but this is first of the several conversations I hope to have. I'm going to come back with more later, I guess, and I hope you will be able to make some more time because I am using Dharampal and his knowledge to reflect on what we are doing today as a society, as people, as initiatives, as academics. So I want to have ask you if there is one thing that you wish, if it was in your wish list to think of something that you think on the occasion of the centenary of the that India did as a nation. It could be the government, it could be people, it could be somebody as small as a university or small college somewhere, or as large as the government of India. What is the one thing that you would see get done as a befitting kind of celebration of the spirit of Dharampal, not the person of Dharampal as much as
Well, I mean, there could be many, but if I were to use D as a word and D standing for Dharampal, I think there are two things that, if we are talking about the centenary, decentralization is something that is the most important theme today, which is what, in some sense, Dharampalji also was standing for, and diversity. The third D might be dialogue. Uh, all these three are missing in the polity today, and Dharampalji said is a good point for us to try and bring these things back into political discourse.
that's fantastic. That's really fantastic to hear that. Three Ds. Now I'm going to put that as a title of this discussion. Okay, one last light to win question. What do you think Dharampal would have done with the social media?
I don't know. I mean, one option was he would have opted out, and been the recluse that he often was. Uh, but unless he had a trusted, person who could tweet along, uh, unless he was demonstrated that the social media is also a way to engage with the youngsters, he probably wouldn't have been excited about it.
Okay, thanks a lot. I remember during the early days of email, he
Uh,
used to always wonder at, okay, when I'm sending this mail and it doesn't reach you, where does it exactly go? And he used to send a mail and then call immediately and ask, "Have you got my email?"
Absolutely. There are many who
And
still do that, I'm sure.
yeah, and so I always used to wonder what he would have done with Twitter. My specifically on Twitter, one to be contained to write in such minimalist language, which is anathema to him because he always said write in long pages.
True.
And second is to look at having to express things within this very cryptic manner, abbreviated manner. And lastly, to respond to all those people who write back to you. Um, so I always wonder what you would have done sometimes. Anyway, thanks a lot for sparing this time. We've been going for an hour,
Yes.
and it's been fantastic beginning for me. Getting you to think through this and bring Dharampal to the current times. Because when I sit with Dharampalji's memories and talk about this, that is more of storytelling at which we do all the time, I guess. But this I wanted to be reflecting using Dharampal's prism for our times. And this has been fantastic learning. I have enjoyed this discussion. And like I said, I hope to come back to you maybe as the year progresses and have more dialogues. And looking forward to that. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Ram, for this nice conversation. And I mean, I was just going to request you if it is possible for you to send the Zoom recording. I will share it with a few students here or research scholars here. Not widely. I mean, of course, the podcast will take a bit longer time for you to edit.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, I will be very happy to share the Zoom recording with you. Only the audio goes into the podcast, though.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's fine.
Great.
All the
Thanks,
best.
Itran.
Yeah. Bye.